I think I'm beginning to recognize some of you, and some of you are possibly here for the first time. So thanks for taking time out this morning. I'm pretty excited to finish on what I hope will be a high note, which is really starting to look ahead and think about a lot of the positive lessons we might be able to take from this, and some of the amazing work that our panel members are doing in looking ahead and helping us re-emerge perhaps in a slightly better state, or at least asking some really important questions of ourselves and each other. I'm waiting to see if we have Jane. Has Jane managed to join us yet?
I think we're still waiting on Jane at the moment, which is okay.
Okay.
No worries. And welcome to those who have just arrived. I'm Paz from the Activator team. It's great to have you guys here for our innovation workshop today, or webinar, I should say. And in the top right corner, you can all find whether you want to show large active speaker view, or you can choose to have the thumbnail video. So you guys can play around with what display view you want for today's session. And we'll kick off in a few minutes. Margaret, is there anything you wanted to say before we kick off? Otherwise, you just let me know when you want me to hand over.
Yeah, I think what we'll do is, I think Jane's probably pretty proficient with Zoom, so I think I would really just start to welcome people and reiterate some of our housekeeping, which is around please mute the microphones unless speaking due to feedback. We would love to be able to speak with and hear from every single one of you, but unfortunately that's usually not possible. So we'll be moderating, but we would ask you to please submit questions and comments through the chat function. We'll keep an eye on as many of them as possible and raise those ones that spark our attention. Our panelists will also call out anything that they feel is particularly of interest to them, and just also to note that the session is being recorded this morning. As we start to kick off, I really would like to acknowledge the people of the Boiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university, and respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders, past and present. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business this morning in particular. So my name is Margaret. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an industry fellow at RMIT Activator, focusing on innovation and talent. And Activator, you may be familiar with, but if not, it is the home of entrepreneurship, enterprise and innovation at RMIT. And I guess our role is to work with individuals and organizations to build the capabilities and the conditions and connections actually that are needed to take to activate opportunities and create new ventures and really make an impact and deliver impact, which is increasingly important given the context we are all finding ourselves in. And driven by that, I guess, we asked ourselves the question, what can we do? How can we make a contribution now that is immediate? And hence this thought leadership speaker series, which we hope will lead on to maybe a more practical application and some help with some innovation tools and support. And Matt, our director, is with us today, and he'll speak to that a little at the end. So I will forge ahead. I'm not quite sure if we have all three panelists. I'm hoping that we do. But we have an amazing panel here with us today. And I will just introduce them very briefly and then ask them to explain a little bit more about what it is they do. First, we have Dr. Jane Burns, who's Mental Health and Wellbeing Innovator for Bupa, is also chair of Open Arms and Street, and really looking forward to hearing some of the amazing insights Jane has based on the work she's doing with those organizations. We also have Julie Demsey with us. Julie's a certified clinical hypnotherapist, transformational coach, and business and startup mentor extraordinaire who made her way to Australia via Silicon Valley. So interested to hear more about that journey and some really interesting hints and tips about what we can do in the right now. And we also have Professor Vishaal Kishore with us, who wears multiple hats. He's a strategist, a political economist, an academic, and a commentator. He's currently Professor of Innovation and Public Policy at RMIT. He's the director of the RMIT Cisco Health Transformation Lab and is also founding architect, deputy CEO, and chief strategy officer of the MedTech Actuator, which is Australia's national MedTech catalyst. So what I would like to do now, given that we have three amazing people to hear from, is hand over to them and perhaps ask them this morning to tell us a little bit about the work you're doing and how COVID and the pandemic is shaping what you're learning and how you're conducting that work and how you're thinking about what's happening today and into the future. So perhaps until I have confirmation that Jane is with us, perhaps Julie, could I ask you to just kick off?
Sure, happy to.
Thank you.
Nice to see everybody here today. So the work that I'm doing as a hypnotherapist and coach and advisor, in one essence, hasn't really shifted, because the work that I do with my clients is all about helping them to achieve the right mindset to reach their full potential and deal with everything that they need to do on a daily basis. But with COVID coming in, we're seeing a lot of anxiety, fear, questioning about where do we go next, people feeling uncertain about their welfare physically, mentally, and financially. And so the work that I'm doing is really tailoring in to hit on those spots and help people, if they're feeling stuck, to get unstuck and be able to get into the mindset where they're able to not only live life in light of what's going on with COVID, but really thrive and look at how do we take life as it has been into life where it is now and into the future.
Great, amazing. And Vishaal, how would you like to frame all of those activities and organizations that you're involved in, and what's front of mind for you this morning?
Great, thank you. So nice to be with everybody, and please let me just add my acknowledgements to the traditional owners of the land on which we are all variously being at. It's really fascinating. As you mentioned, I do have a few different hats that I'm wearing, but the majority of them are all focused on how do we help the health system to transform itself under extraordinary, all the time. And so I really loved what Julie said, which is on a lot of different levels, not much has changed. Those of us who are involved in health innovation and transformation, this is just a slightly different and a new context to do some of that work. But one of the things that I'm really noticing is that we are shining new lights on a whole bunch of things that we probably should have been thinking about, or we already knew, or we kind of knew, but we have paid relatively less attention to. And you can see that in so many ways. You can see that at the level of, particular interventions like telehealth. We've known we should have been doing that for fucking ever. We haven't. And now finally, with the stroke of a minister's pen, we're doing telehealth. Fantastic, great. So it turned out it wasn't that hard. But at the same time, as Julie says, uncertainty and change is always there in everybody's life all the time. We're just shining a new lens on it. We are appreciating it in a different kind of a way. And I think part of what I'm finding so interesting is, what are the things that we are shining a new light on that we should have known before, but now we get to take seriously in a different way? Be it uncertainty, be it the way we actually are really connected in ways, even though we may not see it and we may not feel it, but we are. Or maybe it's, that many of the solutions are here with us and we've just got to get our get ourselves together, talk across boundaries, and push through those initiatives. So I think it's a horrific time for many. It's an exciting time for systems if we capitalize on this in the right kind of way, and if we learn the lessons that are being shown to us right now. So it'll be great to talk about some of that stuff over the course of the next hour or so. Hopefully that's okay, Margaret.
Perfect. We just have a, that's perfect, and thank you, Vishaal. I think we've got lots to get stuck into there. One of the things I was hoping to do was kind of frame the conversation really quite broadly around the idea of what can we do now, what's new and what's next, drawing shamelessly on the McKinsey model, just given the breadth of and scale of what we're trying to discuss here, everything from what can we do about mental health today, some hints and tips, right through to the redefinition of what it might mean to be a citizen in these times. So Julia, if you don't mind, I'd like to maybe flip back to you to really just talk about what's in the now for us. When we spoke earlier this week, we had a really interesting conversation around the amount of information that we are consuming, and from a neuroscience perspective, I guess, the danger of creating negative neural pathways for ourselves, and these quite fear-focused internal narratives around COVID. And we spoke around how we need to move potentially from almost a siege kind mindset to an opportunity mindset, and create that new normal for today that you were mentioning. So could you maybe talk us through in some detail some of the impacts on mental and physical wellness that you're actually noticing, and perhaps some of the mechanisms that you work with clients to introduce and apply to help them overcome that and to manage that?
Sure. Happy to. Thank you. So the first thing is the information overload, right? I think if we were going to all raise our hand if we felt like we're on information overload before COVID started, we'd likely all say yes, right? And now that we're in it, there is so much information coming at us every day that's new information that we don't know whether it's real news or fake news, a lot of information that's actually contradicting itself when you look at different sources. And what happens is when we start taking all of that in and we don't have a real understanding of what is real and what is normal, that puts conflict in our brain, and our brain doesn't know how to process that information or what to do with it. And so that's where the fear and the anxiety and the stress come from. So we've got to figure out how to deal with that. And the first thing I would say we need to do is really curate the information that we're taking in. Think about that information, because from so many people that I'm speaking with, the more they consume, the less they feel they're in control, the less they feel that they have a choice. And the reality of the matter is, there are things we are in control of, there are things we have choice over. But we need to really curate the information we're taking in and think about it. Do we need to spend 4 hours a day digging in and seeing how many new COVID cases there are in each country? Is that pertinent information to us? And is it something we're actually going to use and act on? And we need to start asking ourselves these questions, because that's when we feel stuck and anxious, is when we can't take action and there isn't anything to do about it. So for example, I spoke to a client the other day who said to me, what about all these conspiracy theories out there? Have you been following these? And I said, not really. And I asked him, because he was quite upset about it, I said, okay, so if the conspiracy theories are true, is that going to change any action you take today in terms of how you protect yourself and how you can protect other people and everything that's going on in the world? And he said, well, no, actually that doesn't change anything. So the question is, why do we need that information then? If we don't actually need that information, let's really focus in on the things where we can make change and we can make a difference. So it's really important to ask yourself, with everything that you're consuming, is this something that is beneficial and useful? I've personally stopped watching the news for the most part, and I'm still able to live my life just fine, right? So then we need to get to thinking about, how do we actually move forward and take action every day in a way that's going to be beneficial to us? How do we move from that state of overwhelm and feeling stuck to actually being able to function well? And there's two ways that we deal with that. That's either by shifting our physiology or shifting our mindset. And the shifting of physiology are all the things that everybody tells you all the time in terms of how to take care of yourself, right? Eat well, eat healthy foods, get plenty of sleep, exercise, meditate, drink water, enjoy your friends and family, laugh. Any of those things are going to start to shift your physiology back to that normalcy. And I would add in a new one that somebody taught me a few weeks ago that works tremendously, is have a 5-minute dance party. Have you ever seen anybody dancing? And if you can, play a song that you know and sing to it as well. Anybody who's singing and dancing, are they feeling stressed? No. Are they feeling sad? No. That can quickly change your physiology. And if you're living with other people and you don't want them to see you, go hide out in the bathroom and do that. The other thing we can all do that's completely in our control is breathing. We do this every day anyhow, but we can really shift our physiology when we're starting to feel stressed or overwhelmed by just stopping and taking 3 deep breaths. Breathe in, and if you breathe out very nice and slowly, it starts to calm down your nervous system. And once you've done these things, you can get back to a point where your brain is actually working for you instead of against you. And that's where we're trying to get to. When we've got that state of overwhelm, it's hard to think clearly, it's hard to take action. So we really want to focus in on our mindset. And but even more than that, it's how are we thinking about everything that we're doing every day? If we're spending all that time on that negative news and feeling like we're out of control do for work, the likelihood is we're still going to feel out of control. So instead, what we want to do is really think about, what are the things that are in our control and how can we feel better about the work that we're doing every day? Very often, how many people, if you raise your hand, how many people at the end of the day think about all the things that I should have got done that I didn't actually do, right? And if you're focusing in on that, you're focusing on what you didn't do, and your brain gets stuck in that, thinking all the things I didn't do, all the things I should be doing. If instead we spent 5 minutes every day thinking about, here at the end of the day, here are all the things I actually did accomplish. Done. It sets you up for a success mindset that allows you to keep focusing on what you have that you can control and how you can be successful in moving those things forward. So Margaret, I want to do a check-in with you because I think I'm probably at time there. Margaret, you're on mute. Margaret, you're on mute still.
Yeah, my screen share is doing something quite odd at the moment. I don't know if somebody else has control over my screen. Anyway, thanks, Julie. There's a lot there, and I particularly like that idea, that question of knowing this really, what is the impact on me? Because I'm having, like most people, a lot of conversations at home where I'm having to say to my partner, I think you've consumed enough of that. It's no longer food that we have to manage, but yes, also the consumption. So, Vishaal, I'd be really interested to hear your take on that and how you would add to that, and also really think about, and I'd love you to also take this opportunity to share the work you're doing. And I really have this question that I want to ask is, do we need to really redefine our understanding of mental health now? Are the old models very limited in how we see that? and what does that mean for the role of mental health in society post-COVID?
Lovely. I mean, yes. And also, I agree with everything Julie said. So, but let me just, there was actually one bit that I didn't agree with what Julie said, and that was about the dancing. And actually, because I don't know if any of you have seen Matt Salia, the director of the RMIT Activator dance, but it has such a negative externality. Like if you see this, the stress level in the person looking just goes so high. Like, I think it's a really, I mean, just always look for the negative externalities of one's own behavior. That's what I say. But it actually leads me into something that I do want to talk about, which is, and maybe Margaret, you might be able to share for me just a little document. So all of you hopefully will be able to see this on your screens momentarily. But we at the Health Transformation Lab have been thinking a lot about the way in which the current pandemic is really transforming what it means to be a citizen in the world, what it means to be a human actor in society, in community, in the world. Yeah, I think, yeah, exactly. If you share that as full screen mode, there you go, up there, oh, full screen, there you go, beautiful. So this is not to be read in detail right now, but it's just to give you a feel for, we've been really interested in this basic insight, which is right now, rates of COVID infection, if you were to just look in Australia for a moment, but anywhere in the world, the global population that actually is suffering from a infection of the coronavirus or suffering from COVID-19 is actually a relatively small proportion of the population. However, the economic, social, and communal challenges that we are facing, there's not a single person in Australia who has not been affected by this. Everything from not being able to get your toilet paper to being forced to watch Matt Salia dance, through to being locked in your house and having to work in radically different ways. So in a sense, we at the lab have been trying to figure out, like, we want to be the place where we get to think about, there are wonderful people out there at the Doherty who are going to find us a vaccine. It's going to be great. And then we want to try to solve the social, economic, and communal challenges that we're facing. And Julie spoke a little bit about the kind of dynamics of trust and information and attention. And Julie, I so thoroughly agree with what you're saying. The amount of it, we are basically asking individuals in this really interesting way. We're saying, here's a whole bunch of information that you need to kind of get across. You either need to, or at least there's an implied idea that you need to. And not only is it really important information, but you're going to live or die depending on whether you use this information in the right way. And not all the information is good. So this is a really invidious position to put the individual in. You make them responsible for churning a huge amount of information, and you tell them it's really, really important, but it's extraordinarily difficult to know good information from bad information. So some of the work that we're doing is, for example, we've helped to broker a partnership between Apple News and RMIT ABC Fact Check to try to get better information out there, which has been a really fun thing to be thinking about, a fun thing to be working on. But at the same time as we're asking people to think differently about information, we're asking them to act differently as well. So every individual now, every home is a quarantine site. So it used to be the case that that quarantine was something that was generally imposed by the state or a state agency of one kind or another, but now we're doing it privately. We've radically shifted what the role of the individual is. Do what brings you joy, Matt. Don't say things like that, Alicia. Don't encourage the man. So we're basically, quarantine has become a private function. We're isolating ourselves. The state is not isolating us. We are shifting, and this is where the point about Matt Salia's dancing comes in. We're shifting the relationship between the individual and the collective in really interesting kinds of ways. I don't know if you guys heard something Boris Johnson said when he was, holed up in hospital, in self-isolation. He said, stay at home, protect our NHS, and save lives. So in a sense now, it's an individual responsibility to protect the health system. This is an interesting thing. The health system is usually there to protect us, but now we are taking action to protect the health system, which in turn will allow it to protect us. So this dynamics of the individual and the collective is shifting and changing in really interesting ways. We're learning that we need to, that we can be productive though dispersed. After years of us telling ourselves that open plan working was the best way to be productive and etc. We have learned the truth, apart from the fact that we now know this is probably not the case, but also we are forced into environments where we are required to be productive, whether in terms of work or education, in dispersed rather than the classic collective ways. We're transforming the interface with the health system. So we talked a little bit about telehealth before, but we could use the umbrella of virtualized care. We could think about DIY health, and that goes to some of the information stuff that Julie was also talking about, do-it-yourself health. And I think there are a range of dimensions that we're seeing really, really interesting things happening. And one of the areas that I'd love to just quickly touch on before I pause is some of the work that the lab has been doing to support the system to adapt in different kinds of ways and to release different kinds of capacity into the system. So we've been partnering with a fantastic social enterprise that was originally started up to allow people who live in regional areas to access the health system. So they were basically making hotel rooms available at cut price costs for people, for patients and carers who are coming into the city. And then they realized, hey, we've been helping people do self-isolation, immunocompromised isolation for ages. Why don't we throw ourselves in and run into the breach and try to help release hospital capacity to help people to self-isolate, to help professionals to stay close to work and away from families if they want to do that. So that's been a really brilliant and unbelievably interesting story. Our lab, for those periods of time where we could have visitors, became a drop-off point for goods and services for aged care. So we actually had a hell of a lot of toilet paper at the lab for a period of time. It was really unbelievably beautiful to see the way that everyday regular people were going out and doing complete shopping runs and just bringing that stuff to the lab. We were able to send out tens upon tens of care packages to older people who are self-isolating in really interesting ways. We've been able to get a bunch of ideas out there about how social isolation does not need to equal loneliness, and how we shouldn't call it social isolation anyway, but really we should probably call it spatial distancing or physical distancing. So there's been the unlocking of the latent capacity of goodwill has really been wonderful to watch and really thrilling to be a part of. And I think we would do well to remember two things as we move forward from this. The one is, whether we can give it a funky name like Society 5.0 or something like that, but actually, whatever we might like to call it, I think there is something we would do well to learn. And that is, we've just done the biggest social experiment in the history of work and life, or we're in the middle of it right now, in terms of using different kinds of technologies to work in different sorts of ways, to be in different sorts of ways, to live in different sorts of ways. We should avoid two mistakes. We should avoid the mistake of thinking that we have just given birth to the new normal. That's not true. We've hacked our system, and this is not sustainable in the long term. This is not the future. It's given us a taste for the future, but this is not the future. And I think the other mistake that we've got to avoid is to imagine that when we're through this, whatever that looks like, that we should snap back to the way that we were. So that's the other mistake we could make. Actually, we should learn the lessons. We should recognize that some beauty has been born from all of this. recognize that we've learned some dark spaces and some dark spots that we want to do something about and mobilize around, and recognize that we have the ability to make a different set of choices about the kind of world that we live in going forward. And I think if we could do that, we will have not wasted our time. We will have not wasted this crisis.
Thanks, Vishaal. That's where do we start with that, and how do we follow on from that? But the first thing I would like to do is to say is to welcome Jane and apologise for the difficulties you had, Jane, getting access. And I think actually it's a perfect point to ask you to share your work with us, because there's a couple of things, Vishaal, that really caught my attention. One was speaking about some amazing acts of goodwill. And Jane, when we spoke earlier this week, you mentioned the work you were doing, for example, with veterans and how they've stepped up. And also this idea that we really want to avoid stepping back into the old into our old comfortable slippers and into old models that we've known for a very long time don't actually work and aren't delivering. And Jane, I know that you were very passionate about what you're seeing in terms of inclusivity and more vulnerable members of our society, and some of those gaps that are being exaggerated at the moment. And also looking at where we can innovate and where we can build on, as Vishaal was saying, new hope and positive outcomes. So if I could just hand over to you and ask you to speak to some of that, please.
Hi, Margaret, and thanks so much. I don't know if you guys can see me or hear me, but I did have major technology issues. I have no idea why, but I'm now self-Zooming. So hi, everyone. Can you hear me, Margaret?
Yeah, all good, Jane. We can hear you perfectly.
Fantastic. Okay, so it's lovely to join you. I've tried 2 different devices and I'm now on the phone. I've got 2 kids doing schoolwork online, and I have my eldest, who lives with quite a severe disability, playing his Xbox. So it's kind of interesting ways in which we're living. But to give you a bit of a context around the work that I do, so the last 20 years I've worked in suicide prevention, mental health promotion, prevention, and we have known for the last 20 years that social connection, meaning and purpose is critical to our mental health and our well-being. We've talked about it from a prevention lens. We've looked at it in terms of how do we actually create integrated models of support that keep people mentally healthy, fit and well, while at the same time, how do we actually allow people to get into the right care at the right time? So fast forward to COVID-19, it has indeed been a fascinating space to watch in terms of who's stepped up, where some of the real pain points have been, and how we actually, and I think to Vishaal's point, around how can we actually pivot and change what we're doing. So if I start with the veteran community, again, fascinating to see them step up and say, you know, we know what to do in a crisis. We actually know how to support our community in a crisis, and we know what it means to be vulnerable and to be exposed to real trauma. So there's 2 groups. One, the Swiss 8 guys, they very quickly pivoted a wellbeing and fitness app to provide that to the civilian community. Red 6 is another one where they use geospatial mapping to connect people in meaningful ways when someone's at risk. So it's really interesting to see that shift, the use of the technologies, but also how you might actually provide that in a really quick, easy way to keep people mentally fit and well. We did an online website, which is fantastic in terms of some of the examples of breathing and grounding. It's called High Res, so you can actually jump on. It's a toolkit around the resources and tools that you can use. When we led Young and Well as a CRC, which was all about young people, technology and wellbeing, we created an online wellbeing centre that has a whole host of different tools in it, ranging from an app that helps you breathe right through to Worry Time, which is based on the principles of cognitive behavioural therapy that allows you to put into a little simple toolkit the thing that you're worried about and send it off so that you only worry about it at a particular time. So there's some really innovative, clever ways in which we can keep ourselves feeling mentally fit. I think there's also some real challenges, you know, in the communities in which we work, particularly around disability and chronic illness. Suddenly we're finding actually we can't communicate and connect in the ways that we have previously, which has been very much about someone coming into your home and supporting a person. So how do we actually ensure that people are protected and or that they can get access to food? Again, fascinating and interesting times. Woolies, Coles and IGA stepped up and immediately said, in partnership with the government, will provide services to homes so that people can actually be fed. Now, that's fantastic, but at the same time, with big supply chains like Woolies, Coles and IGA, we've seen that our vulnerable population, so IGA Street, which is a social enterprise, supports young people at risk of homelessness. Our homeless and those that sleep rough and that have less access to support are really struggling with the supply chain. And so the social enterprise, you know, with Street and a whole host of others, essentially pivoted their businesses and just went, okay, how do we actually create a supply chain ranging from seed boxes to allow people to grow their own food right through to accessing food so that we can feed the most vulnerable. So I might take a breath there, Margaret, and but that's sort of the real challenges and pivots. And then finally to the piece of work that I was leading pre-COVID, what do we do around employee engagement and workplace productivity, and how do we support people pre-COVID? You know, mental health was such a big challenge for us, and the Productivity Commission report had talked about the fact that, you know, we spend about $500 million a day on lost productivity, mental health service provision. The quality is not fantastic. We've got duplication, replication. So leading a CRC bid around, well, how do you get an industry like Bupa and others to sort of step up and say, actually, we want to change the game here and look at how we actually create mentally healthy, fit workplaces. Fast forward to now, the conversations that we're having are, you know, how do you actually support your senior execs? How do you support your frontline workers? What does it actually look like to really shift and change what we think about in terms of supporting people to be mentally fit, healthy and well?
Sorry, my internet is getting a bit sticky. Jane, thanks, and great to hear from you, and great resilience and determination to get through those tech challenges. So thank you. And there's so much to think about, and this is such a broad subject. I guess I'd probably ask Julie and Vishaal. I'd like to hear some feedback, Julie, in terms of what you're thinking as you listen to Vishaal, and Jane, what you'd like to add, and equally from you. Firstly, I would like to ask you all if you're happy to share some of the tools you've mentioned. There's quite a lot of requests through in terms of links to breathing and tools. And Vishaal, if you're happy for us to share the poster with all the participants, please let us know. That'd be great. Thank you. So I'll just flip back to Julie and sort of see what's really resonating with you.
Yes, thanks. So first of all of the tools that Jane's talking about completely resonate, and I'm happy to see that that Bupa is putting forward all of these. I think that's an inspiration to other companies to also step forward and do things like that. And I would encourage people, again, like you suggested, Margaret, to share any other tools. I've shared some, but there are many more. And the important thing is to find the tools that work best for you, because different tools will work for different people. And it's all about what's going to work for you on any given day, because that might shift from day to day too. And then to talk a little bit about what Vishaal was talking about with normal, what is normal? I think it's really important, and I was so glad to hear you say that I've had so many people say to me, when are we going to get back to normal, right? And we just don't want to get back to normal. The beautiful thing about what's happening now is it has given us the permission to shift all of our institutions, for everybody to think and behave differently, and to question the way things have been working. So things that in the past might have taken a decade to shift, we're now given permission to start thinking about and immediately making changes. I have some friends in government who are really trying to push through some things that never would have flown before. So I would encourage everybody to think about what is their new normal, what can they do to shift where they're working or where they can have impact, in creating a new normal that's going to leapfrog what the old normal used to be.
Thanks, Julie. I'm keen to introduce some participant commentary here as well. So just Dan, welcome, and thanks for your question for Vishaal. Vishaal, Dan saying you may see it there on chat, but thinking about what this means, and we mentioned, and Jane mentioned, the workforce, productivity and collaboration. Much of your work is about forming connections and systems and networks and collaboration. And physical closeness and hubs are central to this. How can we ensure this type of impactful work continues equitably when we live and work in a more decentralized world?
Beautiful. It was that Dan Sleeman.
That's Dan Sleeman, yes.
Yeah, that's the kind of good question I expect from Dan. So thanks, Dan. I think, so maybe let me do two things with the answer. Let me first just sort of say, I really loved the commentary by the other two panelists about mental health. And I think one of the things that we're really starting to hone in on, two things actually. One is that I think this current situation has made us think about mental health. We've mainstreamed again in a weird way, stuff that we should have known for a long time. So as Jane said, we kind of thought about mental health in a particular kind of way. Now we're talking about how are CEOs coping? How are frontline workers coping? How am I coping? How are you coping? How often when you get on one of these calls with your team or with your colleagues, do you say, so how's everybody doing? And you mean it in a way you never meant it before. And so I think that, I think there's something really interesting and good about shining that kind of light on mental health and well-being concerns and making it part of how we think about our daily routines and our daily work, because it is that central. We just sometimes find ways to distract ourselves or ignore it. So I think both Jane and Julie were saying that, and I really love that. So that's the first thing. And I think Dan's question kind of is not unrelated to all of this, which is to say, what do we do about this, you know, if we recognize that so much about creativity and collaboration and building coalitions and systems is about having an intensity of interaction, what do we do about this? Like, how do we make sure that we keep that ball rolling in a situation of decentralization and disaggregation and so forth? And I think the short answer is it's really fucking hard. And I think you're all finding that. And I had the great good fortune last week of speaking to a small group of students just to see how were they going with transitioning to online ways of working. And what was really interesting that came out of a lot of that conversation was it's the human-based elements that they are really sorely lacking right now. So yeah, technology, you know, things go wrong, but exactly as happened with Jane, we just for finding ways to muddle through that. You know, we're switching devices and we're going to other places and we're holding the camera and we're doing various things. We're finding our way around the technical problems. Yeah, a lot of the time. Let me not say that. I think that's a position we're very privileged to have access to all of these technologies and these kinds of tools, and so that's not a generalized proposition. But in a lot of ways, we're managing around some of those issues. But it's the human stuff that even people with good tech are experiencing. So how do I give purpose and meaning, as Jane was saying, when I'm not in a collective, when I'm not instantly in a collective, when I'm not reaching over and having a conversation across the barrier? How do I give myself a sense of social connection when actually I'm physically distanced? How do I build coalitions of action and interest, even around really purposeful things, when it's just hard to get people to a singular place and get on a whiteboard the way we used to do? And I think, so I think what that's showing us in a sense is, I think it's helping us to understand the fact that our next horizon of investment needs to be on the human-based elements of collaboration and cooperation, and I'll use the word compassion. So I think we need to over-invest in that stuff, in purpose, in belonging, in connection, in compassion, that's where we need to spend our disproportionate amount of our resources and time and effort for the next period if we want to make our if we want to continue this important work in times of disaggregation and isolation. That's one thing. Second thing I think we're learning is actually systems have a lot of dark matter in them. So Dan, you mentioned in your question the point about systems. How do we do this system and network stuff? And I think we can sometimes fool ourselves into thinking that systems are all really visible and they're in the world of hard reality, and that networks are about people in places and hubs and spokes and all of that sort of stuff. But I think actually part of what we're seeing is that there's a lot of hidden stuff in systems that structure systems and make them work. Some of those things are cultural, some of those things are institutional, some of those things are practical. And I think we should turn our attention to those hidden bits of systems that we don't often focus on, but that we probably need to pay a lot of attention to if we're gonna optimize our systems going forward. Those hidden things in systems can be everything from what happens in what happened in. Let me give you an example. Let me see if I can give a really clear example. So it turns out to be the case that 6 weeks ago, if I was on a teleconference and someone's dog ran into the room and the person stopped paying attention to the conversation that we were all having, but started paying attention to the dog, that I would say that there was that person was probably, there'd be part of me that would be miffed about that. There'd be part of me that would think, is this person being as professional as I would like them to be in their work? Are they giving the collaboration everything that they should give the collaboration? And actually now, if someone's dog walks into the room, I am just as thrilled as that person whose room it's walked into, and I obsess about the dog, and I'm excited about the dog, and this is like a highlight of my fucking day. And it's like, so I think that there's something there about we're shifting to a more holistic picture of what collaboration means, what it means to live a human flourishing life, and we should build that in to our collaboration systems. We shouldn't say, yeah, we got to design for this perfect world where humans bounce completely consistently, there's no frictional costs, animals don't walk into rooms, and kids are quiet all the time. Like, I think we designed for this messy, holistic world that's really different. We'll get more human systems. I think we'll get better collaboration. And if we do this right, we'll actually build human technical systems that actually serve us into the future rather than the opposite. So that's kind of theoretical, but hopefully it makes some sense. I can see Julie laughing at what I'm saying, so hopefully other people are enjoying.
Very good, thanks. Thanks, Vishaal. And we had some really interesting conversations last week and the week before as well around how do we bring sort of touch and materiality into our conversations, into these Zoom meetings. And I guess there's perhaps a whole other conversation about as all of those boundaries blur even more between work and home, what are the opportunities there? And there are many. We have a much more holistic view of each other as colleagues, and maybe a deeper interaction. But how do we also keep a piece of us that is that very personal piece also intact as these boundaries blur? So perhaps that'll be another conversation. I think we've got about 5 minutes left. There are some more questions. I don't know, maybe we'll have one around. I'll just throw it out there, maybe to you, Jane, in terms of from Dave. We've been talking a lot about how institutions have managed to move fast and do things they usually told us couldn't be done. But the question here is, do you think that the COVID situation could have an adverse effect on preventing future change in institutions, for example, the NHS or healthcare, maybe aged care, due to the role that they have presently in fighting the virus and their focus on that? So I don't know, perhaps Jane, have you any comment to make on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in there. I think there's a real nervousness in certainly the startup community and entrepreneur community that the big institutions will go back to doing what they've always done. And that's a blanket statement. That's not a comment against aged care or against mental health services. I think the real opportunity for us, and it picks up on the previous comment by Vishaal, is really we've known for a very long time from the lived experience community, whether they live with a mental illness, whether they live with a chronic health condition, or whether they live with a disability, that peer-to-peer support networks and building out human-centered support systems is really good for your mental health. And I just want to reflect on and comment on 3 conversations I've had over the last month. One was with a girlfriend who's lived with a chronic illness for the last decade, and she said there is so much that the community can learn from those of us that have been in isolation, who haven't had the choice and haven't been, you know, empowered to take or been empowered to actually have a voice. And it was really an incredible reflection. She said, you know, we've been fighting for a decade to get GPs to provide online clinical support, and it hasn't happened. And suddenly COVID-19 hits us, and all of a sudden the government can stand it up, and we've got online consultation. She said, you know, we've been fighting for a decade for that, and now it's happened. Another young guy I work with, Caleb Rickson, he had a stroke at the age of 22, almost died. It's the most incredible story. His network's called Genius. And pre-COVID, he had created this amazing network of other people living with disability, chronic illness, mental illness, allowing them to tell their stories and connect in really meaningful ways. So again, it's how adversity can really fuel the human capital and human spirit and the passion that people have. So I'm hoping that we don't go back to the old models. And then the final one, again, a conversation with Nimai, and for those of you who don't know, they're a community-based mental health organisation, and they work with others like Flourish and Mind to provide direct care to people in the community who are at risk of mental illness and disability. And I mean, it was an incredible conversation. The CEO has said, you know, we've known about digital, we've known about the importance of actually integrated care models. We haven't really embraced them, and suddenly we're being forced to. And I actually think those that embrace them not go back to the old school way of telephone hotlines and, you know, structured peer support networks, but really thinking about innovation in that space will probably be those that actually are the greater organisations and really do step up to it. And I want to finish just with a quick one on how quickly we do adapt, and reflecting this morning on my kids getting onto their online school classrooms via Zoom and a whole host of other things. But one of the challenges Harry's teacher, he's my 9-year-old, gave him was to ring grandma, which he FaceTimed grandma, to ask grandma about what it meant to be growing up. You know, when grandma was growing up, who was her best friend, what was her favourite board game. So it's really fascinating to see how quickly we can pivot and shift, and what it actually means. And again, you know, TikTok's been incredible in terms of dance and fitness, but you can also see across it intergenerational dialogue and conversations about, you know, you're bored in the house, well, how do you connect and what does it actually look like? And, you know, I was for a long time really adamant that my kids weren't going to be on TikTok, and suddenly I went, I'm going to check it out. And I checked it out, and I'm like, this is actually an incredible way of generations connecting, and across countries, you know, there are no barriers to it. So I do think we'll move to different ways of thinking. And, you know, the 20 years of work we've done around innovation in digital, I'll certainly be pushing the barrow to make sure that we don't lose that. And I hope that others do as well. And I know certainly a lot of people on the call are very, very interested in how you actually get industry to engage with academia to do things differently.
Thanks, Jane. I'm afraid we're kind of out of time. For those of you, I don't know if you've seen on YouTube, I love that intergenerational piece, and there was a question around that. But if you look up the Irish family in Cork, 3 generations with Grandad in pajamas doing his TikTok meme and dance, it's worth it. And Matzel, you're throwing that out to you as a challenge there, just quietly. I could listen to all 3 of you forever. Also taking away some very personal, I guess, insights around how we think about diversity and mental health. Very much asking myself the question, what's the one thing I should do today, not just for myself, but for one other person? And I'd like to ask you all to maybe think about that as we finish up our series. Thank you so much for your time, your comments, your questions. Thanks to the Activator team who make this happen seamlessly in the background, particularly Paz today, who actually took came and helped us out despite being on leave. So really appreciate that, and really appreciate the energy she puts into welcoming people and making sure everybody is involved and feels happy. I'm going to hand over now to the director of RMIT Activator, Matt Solir, for some final words of wisdom, and what he has promised will be a small but very, very fun dancing session.
Margaret, you set me up well. I've decided to do a dancing session virtually. There's a dance party in the background here. If I put myself in the middle, that could be my hands. Look, wonderful discussion, Julie, Jane, Vishaal. Really, it's always the hardest thing to try and encapsulate what was just a very rich discussion in the last 50 so minutes in a minute and a half. So I think what really resonated for me was that real intent to overinvest in that sense of purpose and belonging. How do we retain the connections, the serendipity, the positivity we get from physical connection, when indeed that is not as easy, and indeed maybe not possible at all. So I think some of that is on all of us, not only on a mental wellness thing, but a physical, that craving we have as humans to have that connection to people. How we find our way to do that digitally is really important. I think, Vishaal, your points around the new normal and not making the mistake that this is the new normal, that we stay with this for forever and a day, but we actually learn from it. We can't snap back to what it was. We can't stay like this forever. What's the place in the middle we find where this collaboration can be enhanced and can be really positively influenced in that? Jane, on your point about TikTok, I've started playing around with TikTok in the last month or so as well. I guess a lot of people have. We had another insight from one of the earlier sessions about Fortnite, and hearing your technical challenges about bandwidth, and that was about how Fortnite actually is a game of strategy, and it's a game of collaboration. You can't succeed unless you collaborate and form teams and work in different ways. And they're exactly the types of things that we need to be modeling. And I think that there's some really important things that perhaps we've discarded or put aside because we thought they weren't real or weren't proper in the way that we're trying to create value or purpose. And I think this is an opportunity for us to do it in a very different way. And I think the panel today really encapsulated that well. To follow up on some of the questions, we will follow up with the links and some of the documents that were referred to, the McKinsey report, the Health Transformation Lab's amazing work and the projects that are ongoing there. I will do another call out to the collaboration with Apple and the RMIT ABC fact check. I mean, we did hear from each of the panelists about fake news in some way, shape or form. It is really critical to make sure you're informing yourself but not getting overwhelmed by that. And that partnership is a tremendous example of some of the work RMIT is doing in that space. So I'd encourage you to look at that as well. The McKinsey report, as I mentioned, and some of the links from the CRC, the Young and Well CRC is now is wrapped up. That's what happens with CRCs, but those resources endure, and we'll make sure we forward them on in the follow-up to this call. So thank you everyone for joining and giving us a little bit of your day. Really do appreciate it. Thanks to my dance party colleagues in the background. And as I said, we'll follow up. We will have a series of more practical workshops through May to start to think about how you operationalize some of the things you've heard in this webinar and indeed the two before. We'll hopefully have Jane and Julie and Vishaal involved in those as well, but actually moving to some actionable things that each of us can take individually or as organisations to move through. So thank you again. We're right on time. Have a wonderful Thursday. Enjoy this short week. I hope everyone's challenges, as we heard from Jane with bandwidth, as all the kids start working from home and partners and others are doing that as well, that are resolved for us, and take care of each other. And thank you so much for your time. Cheers.